Thank you, Biju, for that very warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and to be this lovely, Christ University campus and this magical evening when we had a Christmas illumination still there, and also above all this delightful opportunity to speak to Chinese studies as scholars and teachers and all. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Manoharan for extending me an invitation. So what I'm going to do is to say that the theme he asked me was to introduce questions relating to governance and law in China. So there are different ways in which we can approach that question. So before I explain a basic organization structure of governance within China, just a few words about what we understand governance. Governance is relatively a new term to convey the normative as well as institutional arrangement in any of the societies. But above all, how do we define governance? It also relating the ways in which political power is organized and exercised in any society through designated institutions. This is broadly speaking, this is a case. And in each of these societies, both in Asia and abroad, have evolved into their own distinctive governing model based on their own experience and historical trajectory. China has its own, and India has, and other Asian societies and West. And therefore, it's very difficult to think in terms of a governance model which is applicable to all countries. Because why I'm saying this? Because there was in the past this idea that governance can be a derivative model which has certain universal applicability. Having said that, let me elaborate the basic administrative structure of China. And this when we say administrative structure, it is also about an authority structure, designated institutions, and how, the large territory and population of China is incorporated into a coherent and unified, political arrangement. There are, basically, four levels of authority or organization in China. As you know, the first one is the central government, and then beneath the central government you have the provincial, the provinces as the largest organizing unit. Below provinces you have the prefecture, and then the county, Xian, and the last the village, the Sun. And so this is provinces, prefecture, county, village. This is the four structures that organize Chinese institutions, and then their authorities exercised, and then various kinds of policies are formulated and implemented in China. And each of these authorities have a mandate to do a variety of things. And let me also say that provinces in China, if it is not similar, but almost parallel to the India states. And then comes an interesting issue that, if you look at the China, you can see that in the northern regions you have the Heilongjiang, Jilin, and then comes the Hebei, Hubei, Shandong, and in the east you have some of the most important provinces. All provinces are important, but provinces which have been taking more, not prominent provinces such as Zhejiang, Fujian, and Guangdong, Guangxi, Guizhou, and in the southward you have Sichuan, Yunnan, and up in the western side you have Xinjiang, and then northwest again Shanxi. Why I mention all this because when we study a region, it is important to familiarize ourselves with the place names. Place names will give us a useful entry point to understand the society. This is also important because usually when we study, even when I started studying China, I used to treat China as a unified, singular, aggregated, kind of a political or social formation. But much later I realized that it is very difficult to think of China as a singular and internally coherent, undifferentiated kind of a social economic formation. And you will see these differences, how say the southwestern province Sichuan is different in terms of their cultural makeup, even economic, say trajectories, and the political history in that region from Czechia. And then say provinces up north, which is close to the Soviet Union, say Heilongjiang, Inner Mongolia, much more colder regions, and which are not, often say talked about even within and outside China. See, we must also keep in mind that China, although it's such a vast territory, roughly 60 to 70% of China's population, urban economy, and economy in general, and political, say, institutions, all concentrated more in the, it is not much in the northwest, but it's towards, towards the central, eastern, that part. Say today when we see a commodity product with a label saying made in China, which is actually made in places like Shenzhen, Tungguan, say, etc., etc. So the Tungguan is in Guangzhou, say province, which is located very close to Hong Kong, is one of the. It has become the the what you call the factory of the world. So this, I think, when we study China, we have to keep these differences. Although because of China has been a unified territorial state, Chinese central government has introduced say policies and policies applied to all regions and provinces. There is a long process that went into the making of this modern China, where certain levels of aggregation is possible. However, we will still see very strong, resiliences of local cultural makeup, conceptions of life, economic organization, vastly different from, say, provinces such as Guangdong, Zhejiang, Sichuan, Jilin, Shanxi, etc., etc. In another issue is, say, for example, Sichuan today has become one of the largest migrant-sending, say, province. Say, I think the second will be Anhui province, which come next to that. I mean, I just mentioned these provinces, to drive home one important point that when we study China, it is always useful to understand how differentiated these places and regions are from within China. I mean, one of the most useful book I read on to understand the formation of these macro regions in China was William Skinner's City in Late Imperial China. That actually presents why, say, Chengdu and Sichuan evolved in a particular way. How do we understand, say, physiographical characteristic shaping market, economy, all kinds of things. Anyway, that is. And unlike perhaps about India, China's places are well written about. There's a great deal of literature that exists on, say, many cities, and Tianjin, many provinces, etc., etc. So anyway, the second, the second issue of, say, I said, that beneath province comes a prefecture and county and village. So perhaps in Chinese case, unlike, say, I will sometimes refer to the Indian say administrative structure as a reference point, so that we can say make sense of what is how Chinese administrative divisions are different. In, say, for example, county in China is a very historical kind of a unit. You will see China is one civilization in Asia which had a very strong history of like in the West, documenting revenue records, land relations, taxation details, etc., etc. So today it is possible in China to trace decades of, even centuries of, say, patterns of land relationship, taxation, crop cultivation, etc., etc., about many counties within China. something that doesn't really exist in India. Much of our own historical documentation is actually contribution by the British, say, colonial time, especially in the form of gazetteers and so on and so forth. Yeah, censors, gazetteers, and etc. etc. But on Chinese case, counties are well, say, documented. You will see a lot of, and soon the lowest or the last, the most, the small unit, administrative unit, village, where people have a more face-to-face, largely interactions, where the kinship is very heavily concentrated. Villages are also the most dynamic, kind of political spaces where all kinds of political activism, social organization, economic initiative, entrepreneurial models have taken place. So given all that, this is. But today, when I studied China, China was largely an agrarian society. But today, China has actually transformed into the, when was that last book on, in 90s, that book came out with the title Farewell to the Rural China, the agrarian China. So China has now become largely, if you don't go by the urban statistics, an agrarian, an urban society. So now, how do these 4 levels of administrative structure is governed? You will see that in all these levels there exists, the authority is concentrated in the hands of the people's government. You will see a people's government of the Hubei province, people's government in say Shanghai municipality, people's governments in Sichuan, and people's governments in say county, and village councils in villages. So and these people say government is actually constituted through a due process. When the local party congresses convenes and say elect delegates and then etc. So maybe in the subsequent lectures on Chinese political I saw the lectures that there will be more elaboration on how they say the government authority and party authorities are coalesced, intersect in Chinese, in the People's Republic of China. So we have that, and on the I forgot to mention that along with provinces, China has 4 large municipalities, which these municipalities also have the administrative authority of being a province. They are equal to provinces. These municipalities are Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, and say Chongqing in Chongqing in southwest, Beijing up north, and Tianjin, and then say Shanghai. And these municipalities are say compared to Bangalore. Bangalore's population is something like 8 million. That's what I remember. And these municipalities have well above 20 million population. Shanghai, Beijing has 24, Chongqing is 22, 23 plus. Shanghai is trying to limit the population by 20 million. And China has another some 50 cities with more than 10 million population. And hundreds of cities with population with 500,000 and 1 million. And then many, if you look at the urban statistics of China, it is like amazing, No society in history has become so urbanized in such a short period of time. And when I was working on Shanghai, I was looking at the Shanghai urban statistics, and I found that in 2008, Shanghai's city had more than 4,000 buildings, with more than 20 stories. So you see the built spaces. Today when we study China, it has profoundly become an urban China. So there are new models. I will come to come to those. And second aspect of understanding governance. So this is the administrative structure and which are the agencies and institutions which are in place to govern. See. Now comes to the questions of governance. We understand. We have to see the normative aspects of governance. The norms. What are the kinds of norms through which governance takes place? And governance is also about creating a set of regulatory framework, both enabling and restrictive, within which people, government agencies, and others can act. And there are big differences, So it is very difficult when the more we try to say understand the governance, we see that in China these normative aspects of governance is quietly changing and adapting, and there has moved new directions. And then we will see, in the final section, I will touch upon how laws are now becoming a more important, aspect in China. One way to begin with for many Indian scholars is to say, one important thing is, most people in India share a common sense view of Chinese politics as a highly centralized, of course unitary and illiberal authoritarian regime. Well, to a great extent, a descriptive account of China being an illiberal regime is one can say appropriate. But what happens in India, this is based on my own conversation with umpteen number of colleagues and scholars and ordinary people. They simply contrast this authoritarian structure with that of India's so-called democracy. And democracy in India is always taken for granted. Without realizing that what the democracy in India is an actually existing democracy with all limitations and scopes and scope. So, but the point is that both actually existing democracy and China's so-called centralized authoritarian system have created social and economic outcomes far different from each other. Earlier there was this idea that democracy will automatically lead to development and positive social transformations, whereas authoritarianism by inherently tend to restrict and inhibit capitalist economic development, industrialization, etc., etc. So we are now seeing these old conceptions in political science is no longer really helpful to understand that. And second part is, since China has now become the second or third largest economy in the world, and it's become a highly urban society, and China is also become a successful. The commodity market in China is also an important factor, and largely the development of a highly developed commodity market largely moderate any tendencies of political authoritarianism within. And this is precisely happened in China. That's the reason why when you travel and live in China, you don't feel that these governing structures are restrictive. It is like any other well-functioning capitalist commodity economy. So governance then comes. There is an idea that many scholars in India believe that the normative aspect of governance, when you look at Chinese case, it is by intent and by its nature very inhibitory, regulatory, restrictive, etc., which is not really the case. Much of this has been greatly ennobling for freeing people, their entrepreneurial energies, and etc., etc. I will come to that part much later. So the three points I'm trying to share with you as someone interested in Chinese studies is that develop a view that China is not a flat, aggregated, unified, undifferentiated social formation. No. China is a highly dynamic, highly, say in a way, not multicultural, but at the same time, if you're only presuming about the stable homogeneity of Chinese system, we are wrong. Each region has its own dynamism, its own social histories, and also at the same time. Chinese people still makes an important contribution. They're still the most active social agencies in China in inventing, in making the government to think of a new governing model. Why I say this? I teach a course in comparative politics, and one of the texts we start with is Barrington Moore's that famous classic text titled "The Law," the democracy and dictatorship, Lord and persons in the making of the modern world. And in that book, Moore makes an interesting observation that he says that the economic deprivation and exploitation that the peasantry in India and China suffered in the 1920s were similar, almost. They were under similar kind of a tax extracting regime, the kind of violence the peasantry in China and India subjected to and suffered are similar. However, only in China the peasantry was able to organize itself and carry out a successful transformative process from below. Whereas in case of India, still in most part of the say commercial agrarian transformation has not taken place, the peasantry still suffer a lot. So I have found as a researcher on China that for a very long time, at least from the time of the middle of the 19th century, at least from the time of the Opium War, you will see Chinese people are continuously engaging their government authorities and etc. for new kinds of norms. So China is actually a very right-based society. Conceptions of rights are very, very strongly embedded in the people's consciousness. And of course, during the early, communist movement, conceptions of rights were articulated so successfully by the Communist Party, and that's one reason why Communist Party was able to make a broad social coalition against many other, existing, traditional authorities, and was able to make successful political changes in society. And once a society is being, politically educated through conceptions of right, then it will not just go away. So as a result, you will see in China, even in the post-reform era, people usually demand their rights by articulating through all range of collective effort. And whereas, since I was interested in, labor studies, once I tried to tabulate the number of labor strikes in India and China, to my surprise, I found that China had a far more number of labor strikes, collective action, activities in China. Not only from Tungguan and Shenzhen and in many other provinces. Compared to, say, in India, where trade union is illegal. So this is so there is always a demand, right? A demand from below. So that is the one reason why you will see Chinese government usually respond to people's. One interesting case about China is that Chinese state is very sensitive to people's demands, and sometimes very sensitive and try to solve as much as possible, and not only institutional respond to people's demand, but at the same time also provide a new discursive ideas. You will see that even the Xi Jinping's idea of the China dream and sustain China as a moderate prosperous society. These are all discursive ideas to keep and responding to the Chinese people demand and aspirations, and also to therefore to acquire the regime legitimacy. Here comes another point. When we look at China from here, governance is also about the extent to which an incumbent regime enjoys popular legitimacy. And in India, we generally feel that since we have this periodic regular elections, popular legitimacy is always being tested. And those who do not qualify to be re-elected again, they are defeated in election. So we have in India, there is a system, electoral system, and first past post that arrangement, it takes care of legitimacy. This is what we think. But sometimes we see, simply circulating. We get to elect the same people, but they are not too, there is a differences. But I'm just, trying to make a point here. But in Chinese cases, there is no such as a periodic, constitutionally valid electoral process. Many of scholars think that the regime legitimacy within China is very weak. It's not true, really. Because this is what now really happening. Even in some way, China is actually moving towards a more predictable politics. Why this is important? During the long Mao era, politics was not really predictable. Since the politics was not based on, say, constitution or law or elections or something like that, and even the regime, the leadership change was not always predictable, But in today we will see that for the last, say, 15, 20 years, China is moving to a more predictable polity where the party congress, CPC national congresses are now convened on a regular periodic basis, and there is the most elaborate exercise in which the leadership change takes place. More legitimate, more orderly, more predictable, etc., etc. And that partly takes care of the big issues of, illegitimate actors taking claim and etc., etc. But what I'm saying, I'm sharing with my own kind of an understanding that how do we understand regime legitimacy? We usually understand through, in Indian case, we say that because of the democratic elections, regime legitimacy is regularly tested and then sometimes tiring, and we have sometimes too many elections, and so now we are seeing, given many cases, sometimes elections are not really a strong, a check on non-democratic tendencies. In the case of United States, we see that. So if we say that democratic elections can really check any non-democratic or authoritarian tendencies in politics, sometimes it doesn't work that way. We get all kinds of people, both in Asia and in the United States, and so we have all this. So what I'm saying is, instead of we simply working on this in a dualistic kind of a framework, where, say, India's democracy versus China's authoritarianism, that model is too simple. Yeah. So that is the second part of And another way to understand China's governing issues is that to understand China's governance through a historical comparison within. Most scholars divide People's Republic of China's history from 1949 onwards into two distinctive phases. One is a long Mao era, or the central planning socialist period, and then the post-reform period. This is the but this historical periodization is largely not just convenience. It's more accurate. Why this periodization? Because in each of this period, the central planning socialist era and the post-reform era had different, how to put it, economic rationalities. I mean, we should not say, we should not think of governance completely separate from all these things. And the early phase, say from 1949, early 1950s till late 1970s. The big the crossover moment in China happened in the late 1970s. You know that it was in 1976 China's most important leaders passed away. In 1906 April, I think China's most loved and respected premier, Chow Enlai, passed away because of advanced throat cancer. Then Shuda. Then came that catastrophic earthquake in Tanshan, ominous, indicating something so ominous. And then in September, Mao Zedong passed away. So, that is and for the 25 years, for Chinese people, those who grew up in the pre-liberation times and lived through in subsequent days, they have no memory without Mao Zedong. Because of this, I'll come to that. And then from 76 to late in 79, you have this leader, quite unknown, Hua Guofeng, who was in charge, and then in 1979. Deng Xiaoping was able to become the paramount leader with the help of Ye Jianming. He is also from the Guangdong province, And then we have this whole transformative process. And Chinese Chinese reformist era is actually it's almost a contrast to the Mao era. So during the social central planning era, there was no the whole polity was driven by an idea of distributive issues. The issue was how to introduce social and economic inequality through state of organ. And as a result, you will see that a series of effort from land reforms to collectivization, new marriage law, etc., and also the state bringing under its control much of the property. I mean, this is a very important point, for us to understand that the one of the reasons why China was able to develop in economy in the post-reform era was it's a monopoly control over land ownership, because in China land is by all legal purposes belong to the state, and this happened mainly because of Mao's collectivization collectivization program. And it is so interesting to note today that the post-reform government is using a situation that socialist era created for its capitalist trajectory. That kind of a system, the complete ownership control over the land. Of course, at that kind of an ownership, of course, completely removed privilege and of the landed elite in traditional China in the past. All those things happened. But the key question is, you have a state which actually have a legal monopoly over land rights, which can convert into all kinds of commercial or the other purposes at will. There comes the whole role of, as I said, as I mentioned, the provinces, the prefecture, county in Sun, and these governments, they have the autonomy to intervene in these kinds of relationship, and they could convert, land for commercial purposes at will. A serious issue. It is affecting China now. So the authority structure that I mentioned earlier is actually not although it is centrally organized, but these governments do have a certain levels of autonomy in terms of deciding and designing developmental trajectory. So for a long time since the economic reform began, you will see that a corresponding depletion of China's arable land, the availability of China's arable land, and an unregulated conversion of farmland for commercial purposes at will, and that too under conditions of restricted land market. So therefore the crucial question is who decide upon the land rent? Usually it is the state. So the one reason why China's urbanization takes place the way it did, because of the Chinese government, be at the level of prefecture to county or at municipality or provinces, were never under any compulsion to mediate or negotiate social actors who live in these areas. There is this Chinese government, local government can easily designate an area for displacement, simply, and there have been lots of protests went on for a long time, So that is one of the social history of China today, land struggle. And in political theory, there are all these early ideas of when you remember the cases of the 18th century English enclosure movement, where the newly emerging commercial actors were enclosing land for their own purposes. And then Karl Marx also reflected upon this and saying that this is a process of what he calls a primitive accumulation, a process through which the social ownership of livelihood is taken away from the people and used for other purposes. Many scholars are using such a perspective to explain China's post-reform process, where the state used its authority to displace people from land, and then took that and converted the land for all kinds of commercial processes. And in the next lecture, I will explain how does it relate to China's demographic. And it was this process that produced the largest economic migrants in history in China. A process through which you have a population of agricultural surplus was created by this process, and they become wage seekers and they had to travel to cities. So the 200 million Chinese migrant workers, it is a rough estimate of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is actually creation of a process that went on for the last 30 years in the 1970s, early 80s, from the household responsibility system to in subsequent years, you will see that, and it has a close connection to the China's economy, China's demography, and the rest. And so therefore, the economic rationality that I mentioned, in the is the basis of how governance is organized, because during the central planning era, governance was not an issue of something that can be derived from a written constitution or ideas of legal equality, etc. But the government was basically driven to introduce certain socio-economic equality through intervening in issues of distribution. So the collective resources of the Chinese society and economy was redistributed according to a new redistributive logic. That was something that Mao Zedong really, one of Mao Zedong's legacies is related to this. His a singular contribution to his own commitment to redistributive processes, a commitment to certain kind of inequality. And inequality not simply of legal equality that exists in India, but of substantive equality, social, economic, and also a whole range of cultural transformation associated with it. In China, manual labor is still it has a value, respected, and that is actually a contribution of that time. A certain cultural change, if you are a manual worker, you do to have a certain social prestige, and there is labor is celebrated, and for long Mao era, rural China was seen as a repository of many creative energies. Mao era Chinese politics relied very much on the creative energies of the agrarian, the countryside. But it seems that the post-reform leadership kind of punished I don't know, it may be a wrong way to put it, but looked like, a kind of punished the rural countryside by presiding over a process that dispersed, removed millions of peasantry from their own land. So that is and here comes the whole issue. We have the two historical periods, the long central planning Mao era, central planning era, and the post-reform era, driven by two different sets of economic rationalities. One which was geared to introduce and achieve, substantive equality, and on the other which was driven by, market rationalities of all kinds, commodity production, capitalism, making, making labor, related to kind of wages and compensation, etc. But at the same time, we see the basic organizational structure and administrative structure that China inherited from the central planning era still preserved. This is a problem. This is problem, but it helped look like, So the success of China's economic reform is not really the success of the liberal economic rationalities, not at all. Without the social central planning China, you cannot imagine today's China. There is this belief that even in many economic debates in India that liberal economic models will take care of many of these issues, and just follow it. No. In Chinese case, what happened is, you have this political model which usually, this idea of a state corporatism. And that is a concept. The Philip Smith idea of a state corporatism is used to describe the Chinese political, system. What is state corporatism? State corporatism is essentially about the system of interest representation, in which one representative or agency will be representing the interest of one economic sector. Say, for example, in China, the labor is represented by the All China Federation of Trade Union. And AICFQ is the only legitimate, legally recognized labor union. No other labor unions are allowed. And since All China Federation of Trade Union is the only labor union, and they are recognized, in return, the All China Federation of Trade Union will recognize the government prerogative. So this is the and so you have so this kinds of state corp. In fact, state corporatism is not distinct to China. It has actually evolved in long time in Europe. You will see elements of state corporatism in Japan, in Korea. The problem comes is that this kinds of state corporatist structure, which is a concept which is now used to describe the Chinese governmental system, where interest representation has been given to you have a monopoly. As I said, All China Federal Trade Union has a monopoly in representing labor interest. And you will see that now what happened to that system because of the new in the post-reform era. Post-reform era's kind of capitalist economic rationalities forced Chinese government to undertake a large-scale retrenchment from China's state-owned enterprises. As a result, you have millions of people thrown out of the public sector or the state-owned enterprises, and then the All China Federal Trade Union was nowhere to articulate those people's interests. And you will see the rise of many autonomous labor unions in China, and in fact many of today's China's labor strike is led by, organized by this autonomous trade unions. And you'll also see that if you look back in the 1989 anti-government protest in China, the Chinese government punished the labor protesters more than the privileged university students. Many of them, if you go back and see what happened to some of the most eminent rebels of the Tiananmen Square in 1989, many of them had a great career ahead. Most of them landed at Princeton University and other American universities. A few of them became, celebrities. Of course, for a few years, American Congress and conservative politicians hosted them, supported them. They were given generous financial aid, etc., etc. Of course, then after that, they lost interest. American capitalism was more integrated with the Chinese government. So they lost interest in them. But the point I'm saying that the Chinese students, university students, they were more privileged, and they were arrested. There are cases, but the most severe punishment was meted out to the labor protesters, and this is still the case with in China. So one thing we need to understand is how an administrative structure or governing authority that the Chinese government inherited from its past still in place, and now they're trying to adapt primarily by making a transition to a more predictable polity and rule-based governance is something that the current president Xi Jinping is really trying. And I can explain this shift in case of say one area of law I am familiar with is labor law. And in labor law, during the central planning era, there was no. What is the time now? In case of labor law, there was till about 1994, China did not have a nationally applicable labor law. What China had a series of scattered guidelines, regulations, etc., etc. But only in 1994, China introduced a nationally applicable labor law. And in 2007, China revised the labor law and introduced a new legislation. And the title of the legislation itself was contract labor law. In India, most labor scholars and labor activists are struggling with the whole issue of labor flexibility. What we understand labor flexibility is an end of a system where the workers do not get any employment, security, long-term employment, or decent wages, etc., etc. So, but more than India, labor flexibility in China was induced to the economy by the government itself. The labor law of China, in India, labor law reforms is a most contested issue. Still, no government was able to, even the current government was not able to introduce a fully labor law. Although they tweak with some of the provisions. But the labor laws in India are all ancient. But nobody wants to change it because of it's such a contested issue. But look at China. I was so surprised to see that the very title of China's labor law is the contract labor law. Everything has become a contract. And it basically is flexibility. And also because of the new system such as this, what you call the labor dispatch system, Lautung Paijian, that is a system where you don't even work for a company. You are recruited by an intermediary, and that company will send you to work in other companies. And your actual employer, you don't have an employer. The employer is the labor dispatch company. So what I'm saying is, to conclude, even in a way, China, to my mind, adopting some of the Indian model, which is that in India we had this very an interesting case of if there is a problem in India, what we generally do is to be legislate. And once we pass a legislation, we forget it. Because many of the laws in India have become inconsequent. They become simply a discursive, thing, and then even to retrieve the rights provided in that law through litigation is another problem. It takes minimum 10 years. Similarly, I have noticed that in China, although China is a very powerful state, although there are many of the Chinese legislations and laws are becoming passive. I have actually a book chapter in a new book on China, Beyond Regimes, in which I have elaborated this idea of state labor and state absenteeism. Like in India, the state is missing in many areas where the state has to be there to ensure regulation. Anyway, my presentation was not organized. It was open-ended and touched upon a variety of issues. I'm still not sure which way was this is what exactly you're looking for. So I'll stop here for some discussion and then.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh, for such a wonderful, you get a macro picture very clearly, an insightful one, emanating from his own experience, a long-standing experience. I'm sure there'll be interesting comments, responses, and questions, clarification. The floor is now open. We have 15 minutes for discussion and clarification. I keep your questions clear. Thank you. One thing that made me curious was about the similarity of condition of peasants in India and China in 1920s. Do you think that Gandhian predominance of Gandhian philosophy and the impact that he had in Indian political scenario, did it in any way reduce the ability to retaliate on the part of peasants in 1920s? Was it the reason for the passivity on the side of Indian peasants in comparison with the kind of dynamism shown by Chinese peasants?
Yeah, go about It's a very interesting question. In Barrington Moore's that colossal work, he has not explained these details, but I think this gives us enough, to become introspect this aspect. I think it is not only Gandhi came to the historical stage. A state which was already very familiar to the Indian people, and he used political vocabularies and images which are available to the people of India, which was many things in Hindu philosophy and rural life, etc., and then he was able to articulate for a collective, a common purpose, which was rescuing nation from colonialism. I mean, his project was in that way very much focused on the recovery of the nation, as he understand, in Swaraj and all that. And for a population of India at that time, he was able to communicate using these familiar vocabularies of Hinduism and rural life, and was able to infuse a certain agency to people. And Gandhi was enormously successful in, say, mobilizing rural peasantry, if not peasantry, but the rural farmers, middle to rich peasants, for that cause. But whereas in case of China, when say 1921 the Communist Party formed, and the communist movement took that agrarian turn. In fact, that happened because of a lot of factors, but they introduced new vocabularies of political rights. And this is the reason why the Chinese transformative, the Chinese say political project, the modern political project after Sun Yat-sen, and then became the Communist Party's the mid-20th century political project, combined a lot of things. Not only say rescuing nation from Japanese invasion, that is of course very much, and in fact one of the reasons why Chinese revolution was so successful was this nationalism. And interestingly, when Mao was ailing and he was living primarily in the Chunnanhai in 1972-74 that years, a Japanese delegation, socialist delegation, visited Mao. And Mao being Mao, he sarcastically told them, thank you for that invasion. That helped, Chinese Communist parties to, but what I'm saying is, of course, even the Indians, Gandhi and Chinese communists shared in a way that political project of rescuing the nation. But what the Chinese communists did was to make that project more transformative, with it. The first thing they did was to reject available traditional conceptions of politics, Confucianism. Communists to introduce something new, rights. Rights was not the rights of the the agrarian landed strata, but the agrarian landless strata. The Communist Party owned up the agrarian landless peasantry in China, even though of course the middle peasant. So this introducing a transformative politics, something that in India we missed that. Indian national movement did not have that component of a transformative politics. Gandhi always Gandhi defended the rural life. Although I'm somebody who really recognizes Gandhi's tremendous that contribution, but at the same time, what is missing in Indian that particular juncture was this content of the transformative ideas. So the contribution of the Chinese communists was this is introduce a whole new range of transformative ideas. And how did they arrive at? The first thing they did was to reject the traditional conceptions of politics, traditional conceptions of life, its values. It was this, and this was it was a contribution of Mao. Other communist leaders were still not, early communists, Chandushu and others, they were still not ready to go to that extent. They were still very convenient with the Bolshevik notions of, the revolution and things like that. And but a distinctively Chinese, turn took place with Mao when he argued for this, syncretization of. So the passivity is a big issue, still it surprised me when I have a student who worked on the Bundelkhand present, I had a PhD student worked on Bundelkhand, and in Bundelkhand people suffer a lot, and you still do not see a response to a collective response, but there is still a resignation to drought, to high taxes, to poverty. That makes India again a very a challenging field for scholars.
So you wouldn't pinpoint Gandhi as responsible for passivity in any way?
No, because at that moment Gandhi was able to induce agency. He did his bit by awakening them from their passivity, at least for this project, Recovering Nation. But then Gandhi left it there. I would not say that Gandhi was responsible, because Gandhi did. At least imagine in India, without this idea of Swaraj, at that point in time, although colonialism may have crumbled because of the war in Europe, but still, at least today there is this. But Gandhi's another contribution is, keeping India together. Without India is actually a very violent society. It was Gandhi. Now I realize it is.
Can we take the question? Yeah.
Thank you. Can you elaborate on the relationship between the Communist Party and the local leadership? Say, are the local leadership, like the governors of the province, they are kind of appointed by the Communist Party? So if yes, then how is it done in the Xinjiang and the Tibet region? Can you elaborate on that, please?
Can we take a couple of more questions?
You said that the government is sensitive to people demand. Mostly the people demand there are many, but primarily the higher wage. So whenever they are protesting, whenever they go for a kind of strike, the government saying that there is a public order or something you're disturbing, right? There is a lot of things are going against the people, the labor activism and other things. Year by year, that is increasing. So that affects slowing the economic growth rate, even at present. So how the government is so sensitive to people demand?
To your questions, it's a very complicated relationship between the central government and the local government. Usually you will see many of the Chinese leadership, they make a journey from a province to the center. And then in the process they cultivate contacts. Chinese, you must have heard this idea of Guanxi. Guanxi is a okay. So that is not only in the social but also in politics. Most political leaders have not just Guanxi, they have cultivated alliances, etc., etc. You have, say, Tang Xiaoping coming from Sichuan, then becoming the party secretary. Chao Xiang was from Sichuan, and then now in recent years, a majority of the party leaders come from, say, they all have Shanghai links. Janssen from Shanghai, Wu Jintao had a Shanghai connection. Xi Jinping had yes, Shanghai connections, and but I haven't heard of a leader from Anhui. Anyone from Anhui, I haven't heard of much. So, but now these movements are, and also China also has this problem of cadre promotion. They have each time, in the central planning era, cadre promotion. If you are a party cadre, to be promoted into from, say, village to county level to prefecture, then to provincial say government, and then later to the standing committee or the central committee. It's a big long journey. But the cadre promotion earlier used to be based on some criteria. Earlier it was during the central planning era, it was their commitment to redistributive issues and commitment to party ideology and etc. But today it is not. It is also today the cadre promotion was based on your role in terms of say local GDP growth. That actually created a problem. One of the problems that happened in China is Chinese bureaucracy, party bureaucracy is so efficient. I mean, too much efficiency creates a disaster. And what happens is that everybody, every village you have, as they converted, one way to increase the local GDP growth was to conversion of the arable land to the commercial land, and enter into all kinds of alliance with the real estate interest and etc. Local banks, there emerged their interlinked interest, of banking, real estate, and party. So that worked well. And now Xi Jinping saying no. He is arguing against it, and then trying to cool down things by introducing the idea of a supply side structural reform. What it is supply side structural reform? It is essentially the problem of market glut that Chinese economy has created. Too much urbanization, too much overproduction, overcapacity. Even this, the new initiative of One Belt One Road is also, and I look at as a useful instrument through which China's overcapacity can be distributed to. That issue is there. So now they are changing this. So this criteria was used, in cadre promotion by the central government to appoint, say, provincial, leaders. Because in some cases, some of the provincial leaders did very well in terms of, say, introducing, say, special economic zone. Shenzhen leadership was very, they were credited with that. But what we understand is, the kind of politics. Because today's China, there is no that earlier notion of ideology is no longer in place. Well, I remember once in Shanghai, one party provincial, his local party leader, we were walking to a restaurant. He said, recently the Chinese government asked us to go to Yan'an. Yan'an is a revolutionary base area, and stay there for a week. And then he laughed. He said, why did you go all the way to Yan'an? So although the government wanted to inculcate, Xi Jinping is trying to do that, a certain value. Because during Hu Jintao era, it has completely gone out of, all kinds of consumption and all, In Xinjiang and Tibet, there could be more careful selection, given the sensitivity and, other, factors there, So that I'm not able to answer you, fully, but because I haven't, I don't know much about how that part is done. But just we can assume that it will be more. They have these kinds of considerations. And then the labor, see what is said about the labor protest? Devraj, to answer your question, see, you usually see an institutional response to people's demands in the Chinese. Chinese people will not even tolerate if you increase a tax on food. In Delhi, I lived in a democratic country, and in Delhi I was paying 25% as tax. You know, for for any restaurants in Delhi. Now it has come down. Chinese people will never accept that kind of a tax. There will be revolt, and the government will never try to do that. But in labor, they will. Many protests are of course suppressed. But at the same time, they negotiate. In some cases, you know, in Tungua and Shenzhen region, there is a big, massive problem of, say, many companies just running away from, you know, they have a factory and they shut the factory and then leave. Because, as you know, this is the tendency of, say, global capital mobility. They go and they continuously in search of new regions where they can, you know, have access to more low wage workers and all kinds of things. And also in the context of the financial crisis, many companies lost huge money. So these companies simply left. South Korean companies, Taiwanese companies, they just left, shut the company and then left without even paying money to the workers. So then the local government stepped in, negotiated, the government paid some arrear and etc. But of course some of the workers were, say, those who organized protest, they were punished, they were put in prison, detained, etc. But still there is a response, you know. And now the wages started to increase, you know. The reason for that is different. But as you said, the labor protest and the government, government conceding to the demand will not lead to economic, say, deceleration. No. We usually don't see that. What you're saying that labor protests can have a, say, adverse impact on economic growth.
Yes.
It doesn't happen that way because it also depends on a variety of other, say, demographic factors. We will discuss this later because it is a little complex kind of an issue.
Because the statistics is showing that.
You will see equal statistical evidence to show that heightened labor awareness has actually helped to the economic growth too.
Okay.
Yeah, that is also there.
One more question we can take. Or
I have many questions. I just wanted to we will talk outside also. I just wanted to know, we talked about rights, sense of right. Normally when we talk about right, it is Western concept like that. So elaborate on that a little bit. Or second point is that you made a very interesting point that the Chinese reform government is using the previous structure which is there. When you look at India, the same case, we were using the benefits of the Nehruvian model, IIT model and mixed economy model, and then we had the foundation ready, but we adapted well. Can we just look at that also, something? Or just
a brief response to that is the one difference between the Western conceptions of rights, which is in individual rights. In China, although Chinese communists they rejected traditional conceptions of politics and society and obligations, especially Confucius and all that, and foregrounded rights. The Chinese conception of rights always had a certain, a public, how to put it, that kind of if you say, and you will even see even within Communist Party a moral objections to if you pursue individual, if you are in individual pursuit. So now, Poshila is projected as a case whose individual pursuit for power and is morally not justifiable. So somewhere, but whereas in case of the Western conception of rights is primarily personal individual rights. Individual rights which is protected by law, constitution, you have all, Bendam and J.S. Mill, together. But in case of China, right, the roots to right is not through Bentham or Mill, but still you have a traditional, certain, see, this, and Chinese communist, say, moral conceptions, it's also there, collective,
Okay.
and something which the people also agree. That's one reason they don't really miss elections. Also, they like democracy. So there is a common, that's a big difference between Hong Kong and mainland. Hong Kong is a deeply liberal universe, whereas in China still has a strong collectivist tendency.